Hello folks, and welcome to the channel, or welcome back. And in this episode we're going to talk about fuels. Now recently I've had a lot of discussions with my friends and colleagues about what type of fuel to use in your classic race car, in your race car, or your old-timer, your classic car. Because today's fuels are no longer or are not fit for purpose nor for use. And the reason that I'm saying is that modern fuels have what we call an additive to it. I'm not going to get into great detail about the fuel composition, how it's built, and all the elements that make up a very specific characteristic of the fuel. And in most cases, we're adding ethanol, which is an alcohol. Sometimes they add 5% or 10%, and depending how much ethanol is being added to the fuel, the cheaper the fuel becomes. But of course, it has a lot of negative effects, specifically on older cars. At the gas station, I have the choice between 98 and 95 for gasoline. And 98 and 95 refers to the octane number. So the higher the number, the better the octane value. And octane prevents the engine from knocking. In fact, it creates stability in the burning of the fuel. You will also notice that there is an additional number on there, and it's called the E10 or the E5. And if you look closely, you will see that the 98 octane fuel is having an E5 marked on it, and that means there is 5% ethanol added to the fuel. The 95 octane fuel has an E10, and that's 10% of ethanol being added to the fuel. And ethanol is the result of a bioprocess from biomass, and it creates a type of an alcohol which is added to the fuel that makes the fuel actually cheaper, but also more environmental friendly, but has a couple of side effects, and those can be disastrous for your old-timer or your classic racing car. So how bad are now classic fuels for your race car and or your classic old-timer? Modern fuels are quite all right in modern cars, but in old cars that are having different rubber tubes, different rubber seals and gaskets, or even membranes, that ethanol may actually affect that rubber. And I've seen it on my old race cars, whereby the rubber actually melted away over time, and I developed a fuel leak while I was on a track. Not a good thing to have. When I got this race car, I had a problem with these fuel hoses. They were not resistant to ethanol fuel, and I was actually driving with ethanol-based fuels. It was the E5, not too bad, but still, they became weak over time, and it developed the leak while I was on the track. That was not a good thing to have. So I have changed all these hoses out. So this is one of the changes you would have to do in your car as well if you decide to drive with ethanol-based fuels. So for your classic car or your race car, keep in mind if you're going to run with modern fuels with E10 or E5 ethanol in it, make sure that you have no old-style rubber hoses. Replace them where you can with modern fuel or ethanol-resistant hoses and seals and membranes and so on. So that's the first thing. So this is something you really should do. I also have noticed that there can be serious problems with gas tanks. The gas tank in my RP30, which is a Formula Ford, is made out of polyester. And I've seen ethanol fuels dissolving the polyester. Meanwhile, I have fixed this. Now it's an aluminum tank that I covered with polyester, but the original tank was only polyester. And when I left the fuel in there for a long time, it started to weaken the polyester and it started eating it away. So you got polyester parts and all this kind of crap in the fuel, which you're sucking into the engine, and at the same time you develop a high risk area by a softened and weak gas tank. There are also some benefits of modern fuels, and that's just basically because that fuel is cheaper. I'm paying around €2 for 1 liter of 98 with ethanol of 5% in it. If I'm going to race fuel, a 102, this is going to run me about €5 for a liter, but it's worthwhile. And then we're coming to the most critical negative effect of ethanol, which is what we call a knock. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about octane and what it does in terms of knocking or pinging on an engine. When we tune our cars, we are setting the ignition time at X degrees before top dead center. And we do this to ignite the air-fuel mixture in advance. So we get the maximum burn rate or the maximum explosion, the maximum force, just after top dead center because fuels have a latency to burn. Now, the burn time of fuel is drastically changed depending on how the fuel is composed. If we put in ethanol into fuel, then there is a much faster burn rate. So you will have to adjust your ignition with less advance, especially on higher RPMs. But if you drive the car and you have a high compression engine, typically for a race car, and I would say as of 12 to 1 in terms of compression ratio and higher, we're going to develop a lot of heat inside the cylinders and a high compression. And then these modern fuels with ethanol added to it, be it 5 or 10% or even more in some cases, are becoming kind of unstable, if I may use that word. They are not very stable in their burn time, and they may actually self-ignite. They may ignite before you actually issue the spark. Now, if that happens, that force of that explosion, that combustion, will come most likely too early, and it's going to knock on that piston. The piston is actually moving up on the compression stroke to top that center, but before it even hits it, you got this combustion. So it's going to kind of hit back that piston in the wrong direction. It should do it after top that center, but not before. And this is what we call knock effect, pinging. A very bad thing to have on your engine. It's going to destroy your engine. So modern fuels with E5 or E10 in it, they are not stable enough for high RPMs and high combustion engines from the old days. With today's ECUs and all that, that's a different story in modern cars, but not with old cars. And that is why we say that modern fuels are not that good to run on old classic race cars and even old cars in general. I mentioned to you that a compression ratio of 12 to 1 already warrants the use of race fuel. This engine right here is a modified engine. It is a race engine. It's an MGB. It has a 1950cc engine in it, special camshaft, and all these different things that are modified on this car. It develops about 180 horsepower, and it runs up to 7,500 RPMs. It has a very high compression ratio for this type of an engine, which is about 13.5 to 1. And therefore, race fuel is really needed on this engine, because otherwise I will probably damage it in higher RPMs because of the knocking effect. The same applies to my Pinto engine that I have in the RP30. Although this is not really heavily modified, it develops about 140 horsepower, but I'm doing quite some RPMs with it. And therefore, I want to have that stability of that fuel. I want to have that prevention of knocking, and that's why I'm using on these cars always 102. There is one more thing I need to clarify. In many of the discussions that you might have with your friends, you will hear that, oh, I got 12 or 13, 14 kilograms per square centimeter of compression on my engine, so I have a high compression ratio. Yes, I know. Compression ratio and measuring the compression on a car are two different things, but they relate very closely to each other. However, measuring the compression on an engine is subject to many different things. It's subject to your valve timing, it's subject to your valve or your tappet clearance. Many, many things come into play, the blow-by of the cylinders and so on. So that will give you a distorted picture, whereby a compression ratio is a design factor where you calculate the volume of displacement within the cylinder between bottom dead center and top dead center, but also including the thickness of the head gasket and the combustion chamber all the way in the top, often in the cylinder head. So it's a bit different, but of course they relate, right? So if you have a high compression ratio engine, you're probably going to measure a high compression if the engine is in a good condition. If you have a low compression ratio engine, you're not going to measure a high compression on the engine. But it's not exactly the same. So it's not necessarily true if you measure, let's say, 10 kilograms per square centimeter or 11 kilograms per square centimeter, that your engine is actually having a low compression ratio. It may have a high one, but maybe the valves are only adjusted or the valve timing is off and things like that. So keep that in mind in your discussions. So far we have looked at the effect that ethanol could have on your classic car, on your race car, on your rubber hoses, on your seals, on your gaskets, or anything that comes in contact with the fuel. We also have looked at the ethanol knock-in effect. So we know that the more ethanol you get into your fuel, the more we increase the instability in terms of knocking. So you might have pre-ignition of that fuel mixture. At the moment you don't want to have it, and that's devastating for an engine at higher RPMs. But of course, there's also something positive to be stated about either doped or enriched classic fuels, and that is that they are cheaper than race fuel, which does not have ethanol in it, and that's about the only thing. Now, when does it make sense to go for a race fuel? That's the key question here. Well, besides the fact of damage to your hoses and to your gaskets and all that, as I explained, and you don't have a high compression engine, then probably it might not be worthwhile the money if you made all the necessary adjustments on your car to run with ethanol-based fuels, because it's not going to give you more power, not on a low compression engine, because that knocking effect really happens on a high compression ratio engine. So at that point, maybe you might want to keep driving with your normal commercial fuels that you have available to you. Or you could even add an additive to it, what some people do. But there are some more gains to be made with racing fuel. So fuel without ethanol. And that is power gain. We want to have more performance, and you're going to get some more performance out of race fuel with a proper setup engine. Of course, you will have to change your advance curve on your ignition, but once you've changed all that, you're going to get a much, much better performance out of it, because that fuel is going to give you more stability in the burn rate, but also it will prevent knocking. So it's much safer for your car, and you're going to get better performance, because the power that fuel without ethanol develops is more than fuel with ethanol. Now, is it huge? No. Is it something you will feel? Yes, but it's not tremendous, right? It's not, a new invention. It's not going to be like this. You're not going to gain 20, 30, 40 horsepower, but you will feel the effect of it. So now the question then is, what do you think? Should you go for that fuel or not? So folks, we are coming to the end of this video, and my advice would be, and who am I to give you advice anyway, is to use race fuel if you have an old classic race car, if you have a classic car, and you have not changed or protected any of the hoses, any of the gaskets, or any of the membranes. It's still all the original stuff, and you're not sure if this stuff is going to be attacked or not by ethanol. Don't take any chances or change everything to ethanol-resistant pipes. But if you still then are into the high performance area with high compression ratios, then by all means go for that race fuel, because that's going to protect the engine at higher RPMs and at higher heat because of the octane value, which is so much higher, and you don't get this pre-combustion or unwanted combustion of the mixture that you typically might encounter with ethanol-based fuels. And in addition, that fuel that we have there, the race fuel 102, is reducing the carbon buildup. And you do get some performance increase as well, because this is at the end everything we want to have. Reliable engine at high RPMs, no knock, and performance increase. And that's what race fuel will do for you. If it's too much money for you, then fine, you can still drive your cars with ethanol-based fuels. There's no issue as long as you do the needed modifications and adaptations for that modern fuel. Thank you for viewing, and please, by all means, comment.